Here is a question that history has never properly answered. How did a scattered population of farmers and fishermen, living in some of the most unforgiving terrain in Europe, numbering fewer than 2 million people at their peak, project their power, their influence, and their physical presence across a wider stretch of the earth than the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, or the Chinese dynasties ever managed? Rome had legions, roads, aqueducts, and a centralized government that taxed and administered millions of subjects across 3 continents. Persia had a bureaucracy so sophisticated that its postal system could deliver a message across the empire in a matter of days. China had the largest standing armies the ancient world had ever seen. The Norse had none of these things. They had no capital city. They had no emperor. They had no unified state, no standing army, no tax collectors, no written legal code for most of their history, and no centralized command structure of any kind. What they had were boats, blades, and a social system built entirely on the personal loyalty of free men who could choose to follow a leader or walk away whenever they pleased. And with that, and nothing more than that, they built the largest geographic network of any pre-modern civilization on Earth. That single fact should be enough to make anyone stop and rethink everything they were ever taught about how power works. 8th century Scandinavia was not a nation in any sense that the rest of Europe would have recognized. It was a vast, fragmented patchwork of chieftaincies, petty kingdoms, farming communities, and fishing villages spread across the coastlines and valleys of modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The terrain itself prevented anything resembling unity. Norway was carved by deep fjords and mountain ranges into isolated valleys where communities could go entire winters without contact with the outside world. Sweden was a maze of dense forests and lake systems that divided its people as effectively as any border wall. Denmark, flatter and more accessible, came closest to producing centralized authority, but even there, power remained local, fiercely contested, and never permanent. A Norse chief held his position only for as long as he could deliver results. The moment the raids stopped producing silver, the moment the harvests fell short, the moment a leader showed weakness or poor judgment, his followers were free to leave and pledge themselves to someone more capable. There was no inherited obligation, no divine right, no feudal contract binding a man to a lord. Power was earned voyage by voyage, season by season, and it could evaporate in a single bad decision. This was a system that rewarded competence with a ruthlessness that no medieval European monarchy could match. And yet this fractured, leaderless, institutionally bare society did something that no centralized empire in history had ever accomplished. It expanded in every direction at the same time. This is the detail that most histories skip past, and it is the detail that changes everything. Every other great expansion in the human record followed a recognizable pattern. Rome pushed outward from the Mediterranean in a broadly continuous wave. The Mongol conquest swept across the Eurasian steppe along a single devastating axis. The Arab conquests radiated from the Arabian Peninsula in identifiable stages. The Norse did not do any of this. They did not expand along a frontier. They expanded like an explosion, sending tendrils of trade, exploration, warfare, and settlement in every possible direction simultaneously. The Danes pushed south and west, flooding into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England and the Frankish territories of mainland Europe. They besieged Paris. They carved out a permanent kingdom in eastern England called the Danelaw. They extracted so much silver in protection payments from terrified English and Frankish kings that the tribute, known as Danegeld, nearly bankrupted entire realms. At the same time, the Norwegians pushed west across the open Atlantic, hopping from island to island, from Scotland to the Faroes to Iceland to Greenland, and finally to the coast of North America, setting foot on the continent a full 500 years before Columbus was born. And while the Danes went south and the Norwegians went west, the Swedes turned east. They pushed their shallow draft longships down the river systems of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, portaging overland between waterways, establishing trade posts and fortified settlements along routes that connected the timber and furs of the north to the silver markets of the Islamic world and the silk workshops of Constantinople. 3 directions, 3 entirely distinct strategies of expansion, all happening at the same time, driven by the same culture, the same language, the same gods, and the same fierce, unrelenting refusal to accept the limitations of the world they were born into. This is the story of how all of that unfolded, how far each path reached, and what those paths left behind in their wake. But it is also, and more importantly, the story of how all of it ended. Because the Norse did not fall the way empires are supposed to fall. There was no great military defeat, no sacking of a capital, no catastrophic plague, no foreign conqueror who brought them low. What happened instead was stranger, and in many ways, more devastating. Over the course of roughly a single century, the Norse were absorbed, converted, assimilated, married into the very populations they had once raided and ruled. Their kings adopted a foreign god. Their warriors became bodyguards for foreign emperors. Their settlers forgot their own language within 2 or 3 generations. They did not collapse. They dissolved, silently and almost completely, like salt poured into warm water, leaving behind only faint traces of something that had once been vast and vivid and terrifyingly alive. How a civilization could build something that enormous and then simply cease to exist is one of the strangest questions in history. And to begin answering it, we need to follow the 3 paths separately, starting with the most surprising one of all, the one that most people have never even heard of, the path that led Norse warriors and traders not west toward the Atlantic but east, deep into the rivers of Russia, and from there to the golden throne rooms of Constantinople and the bustling markets of Baghdad. While the monks of Western Europe were writing terrified letters about Norse raids on their coastlines, while kings in England and Francia were scrambling to build defences and scrape together enough silver to pay the Danegeld, something very different was happening in the opposite direction. A quieter expansion, far less dramatic but far more profitable, was pushing east out of Sweden and into the vast, uncharted interior of Eastern Europe. The men who led this expansion were not primarily raiders, they were traders, and the network they built would become one of the most extraordinary commercial systems the medieval world had ever seen, connecting the frozen forests of Scandinavia to the richest markets on Earth through a chain of rivers, portages, and fortified trading posts that stretched for thousands of miles across some of the most dangerous and inaccessible terrain in Europe. The Norse who went east were known by several names. The Slavic peoples they encountered called them Varangians, but the name that stuck, the name that would echo through 1,000 years of history and eventually give its identity to the largest country on Earth, was Rus. The origin of this word has been debated by scholars for centuries, tangled up in modern Russian nationalism and the politics of who gets to claim the founding of a nation. But the most widely accepted explanation among linguists is that Rus derives from an Old Norse term related to rowing, referring to the men who rowed the boats that pushed down the eastern rivers. The men who row. It is a plain, working description, and it fits perfectly, because what the Rus did was not glamorous. It was grueling, dangerous, and relentless. They took their shallow-draft longships, vessels light enough to be carried overland by their crews, and they pushed them into the river systems that drained the vast interior of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, down the Volga toward the Caspian Sea and the Islamic world, down the Dnieper toward the Black Sea and Constantinople. These were not open ocean voyages of the kind the Norwegians were making in the Atlantic. These were slow, grinding journeys through dense forests, across mudflats and marshes, through rapids that could destroy a boat in seconds, and across long stretches of open land where the rivers did not connect, and the boats had to be physically dragged on log rollers from one waterway to the next. They called these stretches portages, and some of them were miles long, miles of hauling a fully loaded trading vessel through hostile territory, where Slavic and Turkic peoples controlled the land and did not always welcome the strangers passing through. What made it worth the risk was what waited at the other end. The Islamic world in the 9th and 10th centuries was the wealthiest civilization on the planet. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, presided over a vast economy that ran on silver coinage, and that economy had an almost limitless appetite for the goods the Norse could supply. Furs were the most valuable commodity. Sable, fox, marten, beaver, the forests of the north produced pelts of a quality that could not be matched anywhere in the warmer south, and wealthy buyers in Baghdad, Damascus, and Constantinople would pay extraordinary prices for them. Amber from the Baltic coast was prized for jewelry and decoration. Honey and beeswax were traded in large quantities, but there was another commodity that moved down those rivers in even greater volume, one that histories have often been reluctant to discuss honestly: enslaved human beings. The Norse slave trade was enormous, and its primary source of supply was the Slavic population of Eastern Europe. Captives taken in raids and wars were transported down the river routes and sold in the markets of Constantinople, the Caspian trading towns, and the Islamic world. The demand was constant, and the profits were staggering. Some historians believe that the very word slave, which appears in nearly every European language, derives from Slav, a grim testament to the scale of this traffic. The Eastern Road was paved with human suffering, and the silver that flowed back to Scandinavia in return was, in many cases, the price of human lives. And that silver did flow back, in quantities that still astonish archaeologists today. Tens of thousands of Arab silver dirhams have been found in Scandinavian burial sites and buried hoards, coins minted in Baghdad, Samarkand, and other cities of the Islamic world, carried north along the river routes and deposited in the earth of a land thousands of miles from where they were made. The island of Gotland, a small Swedish island in the Baltic Sea that served as a major Norse trading hub, has yielded more Arab silver coins than almost any archaeological site in the Middle East itself. That single fact tells you everything you need to know about the scale of what the Rus had built. This was not a minor trade connection. This was one of the great commercial arteries of the medieval world, and it pumped wealth northward into Scandinavia for over 2 centuries. The most vivid surviving account of the Norse on the eastern rivers comes from a man named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered a group of Rus traders on the banks of the Volga River in 921 AD. Ibn Fadlan was an educated man from Baghdad, a representative of one of the most refined civilizations on earth, and he recorded what he saw with the unflinching detail of someone watching customs he found both fascinating and deeply disturbing. He described the Rus as physically impressive, tall and tattooed, each man carrying an axe, a sword, and a knife at all times. He described their trading practices, their rituals, their disregard for what he considered basic hygiene. And then he described a funeral. A Norse chieftain had died, and his people were preparing to send him off in the old way. They placed his body on a ship drawn up on the riverbank. They sacrificed animals and laid them around him. They dressed him in fine garments. And then a slave girl, a young woman who had been chosen or who had volunteered to accompany her master into death, was led onto the ship. Ibn Fadlan recorded that she was given strong drink until she could barely stand, and that an old woman called the Angel of Death placed a cord around her neck while a blade was driven between her ribs. The men around the ship began beating their shields with sticks, filling the air with noise so loud that it drowned out her final sounds, so that the other enslaved women in the camp would not hear and would not be afraid when their own time came. Then they set the ship on fire. Ibn Fadlan watched it burn. He wrote it all down, and his account survived, preserved in the libraries of the Islamic world for 1,000 years, a moment of contact between 2 civilizations captured in detail so raw that it still has the power to disturb. But the Eastern Road did not end at the trading posts of the Volga. It continued south, past the rapids of the Dnieper, through the Black Sea, and all the way to the greatest city in the Christian world. And there, in the marble halls of Constantinople, the Norse did something that nobody could have predicted. They did not come to raid. They did not come to trade. They came to serve, and in doing so, they became the most feared and most trusted military unit in the medieval world. Constantinople in the 10th century was not just a city, it was the center of the world. Nearly 500,000 people lived within its walls, making it the largest city in Europe by an enormous margin, dwarfing London, Paris, and Rome, which were little more than muddy towns by comparison. Its harbours were choked with merchant ships from every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. Its markets sold silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa, and furs from the frozen north. The Theodosian walls, a triple line of fortifications that had protected the city for centuries, had never been breached by a foreign army, and they gave Constantinople an air of permanence that no other city in the Christian world could claim. At the heart of it all sat the Byzantine emperor, ruler of the eastern remnant of the Roman Empire, God's representative on earth according to the theology that underpinned his authority, presiding over a court of such wealth and sophistication that foreign visitors routinely described it as the closest thing to heaven they had ever seen. The throne room of the great palace contained a golden tree with mechanical birds that sang, a golden lion that roared and moved its tail, and a throne that could be raised and lowered by hidden machinery so that the emperor appeared to float above his visitors like a living god. It was designed to overwhelm. It was designed to terrify. And behind all of that gold and spectacle, behind the singing birds and the levitating throne, the man sitting on it lived in constant, suffocating fear that someone in his own court was going to kill him. Byzantine politics was not a game. It was a bloodbath conducted in whispers. The history of the Byzantine Empire is a catalogue of assassination, mutilation, poisoning, blinding, and betrayal on a scale that makes the politics of any other medieval kingdom look almost quaint. Emperors were strangled in their beds by servants. They were blinded with hot irons by their own brothers. They were deposed by generals who then ruled for a few years before being deposed in turn. The court was a nest of competing noble families, ambitious military commanders, scheming church officials, and foreign diplomats, every one of them calculating, every one of them watching for the moment of weakness that would let them seize the throne or profit from the man who did. An emperor could trust no one who had roots in the empire itself, because anyone with roots had ambitions, and anyone with ambitions was a threat. This was the problem that gave birth to one of the most extraordinary military institutions in history. If you could not trust your own people to protect you, you hired foreigners, and not just any foreigners. You hired men from so far away, from a culture so different, that they had no possible stake in Byzantine politics, no family connections to exploit, no local loyalties to corrupt. You hired men whose allegiance could be secured with one thing and one thing only: gold. You hired the Norse. The Varangian Guard was formally established in the late 10th century, though Norse warriors had been serving Byzantine emperors in smaller numbers for decades before that. The arrangement was elegantly simple. Norse fighters, mostly from Sweden but later from across Scandinavia and even from Norse settlements in England and Iceland, travelled down the river routes to Constantinople and offered their services to the emperor. In exchange for their loyalty and their fighting ability, they received pay that was astronomical by the standards of anything available back home, access to the wealthiest city on earth, and a privileged legal and social position within the imperial court. They carried massive two-handed axes as their signature weapon, and they became the emperor's personal bodyguard, the last line of defense between the throne and anyone who wanted to take it. They guarded his bedchamber at night. They stood beside him during state ceremonies and public appearances. They accompanied him on military campaigns. And when the coups came, as they always did, the Varangians were expected to fight to the death to protect the man who paid them, regardless of the politics involved. By most accounts, they did exactly that, again and again, earning a reputation for terrifying reliability that made them the most feared soldiers in Constantinople, more trusted by the emperor than any unit of native Byzantine troops. The most famous man to ever serve in the Varangian Guard was a Norwegian prince named Harald Sigurdsson, known to history as Harald Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler. He arrived in Constantinople around 1034, a young exile from the brutal power struggles of Scandinavian politics, and he spent the next decade fighting in the emperor's name across a stunning range of battlefields. He campaigned in the Mediterranean, fighting Arab forces in Asia Minor. He fought in Sicily. He fought in the Holy Land. Byzantine sources describe him leading assaults on fortified cities, commanding naval engagements, and surviving palace intrigues that would have destroyed a less cunning man. He accumulated an enormous personal fortune, partly from his military pay and partly from the Byzantine custom that allowed the Varangian Guard the right to plunder the imperial treasury at the death of an emperor, taking as much as they could carry. When Harold finally left Constantinople, he was one of the wealthiest men in northern Europe, and he used that wealth to claim the throne of Norway. But his ambition did not end there. In September of 1066, Harald Hardrada invaded England with a massive fleet, seeking to claim the English crown for himself. He was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the forces of the English king Harold Godwinson, and just 19 days later, another army landed on the southern coast of England, led by William, Duke of Normandy, a man whose ancestors were Norse settlers who had been given land in France a century and a half earlier. Two Norse legacies, one still recognizably Scandinavian and one completely transformed into something French and feudal, collided at the exact moment that decided the future of England forever. Harold the Varangian died as one of the last true Norse warriors. William the Norman conquered as something new, something the Norse had become after they forgot who they were. There is one more detail about the Varangian Guard that needs to be told, and it is a small detail, but it may be the most human moment in this entire story. In the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in all of Christendom, the building that represented the pinnacle of Byzantine architectural and spiritual achievement, someone carved Norse runes into the marble railing. The inscription is weathered now, difficult to read in full, but scholars have identified at least one name scratched into the stone. A Varangian guardsman, standing watch during some long ceremony in the cathedral below, bored and far from home, took out a blade and carved his name into the most sacred building in the Christian world, the way a restless teenager might scratch initials into a school desk. It is still there. 1,000 years later, you can still see it. A small, imperfect, deeply human mark left by a man from the fjords of Scandinavia who somehow ended up standing guard in the most important room on earth, 1,000 miles from anyone who spoke his language or prayed to his gods. It is, in its own quiet way, the most powerful proof of how far the Norse reached and how completely they wove themselves into the fabric of a world that was never supposed to be theirs. While these warriors were guarding emperors in the Golden East, their cousins on the other side of Scandinavia were doing something even more audacious. They were building ships, loading their families aboard, and sailing west into the open Atlantic, past the edge of every map that existed, looking for lands that might not be real, chasing rumors carried back by storm-blown fishermen and half-believed sagas. And what they found out there, beyond the horizon, would remain one of history's best-kept secrets for nearly 1,000 years. The Norse who went east became traders and imperial bodyguards. The Norse who went south and west into England and Francia became raiders and kings. But the Norse who went straight out into the open Atlantic became something else entirely. They became gamblers, and every generation, the bet got bigger, the odds got longer, and the ocean got more dangerous. The westward expansion of the Norse was not planned by any king or directed by any central authority. It was driven by the same force that had launched every other Norse venture men who had run out of options at home and decided that the unknown sea was a better gamble than the certain misery of staying put. Outlaws, exiles, younger sons with no inheritance, men who had killed one too many neighbors, men who would rather risk drowning in the North Atlantic than live under the authority of someone they considered unworthy. And one by one, island by island, these men pushed the boundary of the known world further west than any European had ever gone, further than anyone believed it was possible to go, until they had crossed the Atlantic itself and stood on the shore of a continent that the rest of Europe would not reach for another 500 years. It began with Iceland. In the 860s and 870s, a wave of Norwegian chieftains and their followers began sailing west to a large, volcanic island that had been spotted by earlier sailors blown off course in the North Atlantic. The timing was not coincidental. Back in Norway, a warlord named Harald Fairhair was doing something that no Scandinavian leader had ever managed before. He was unifying the country under a single crown, crushing the independence of the regional chiefs who had ruled their own territories for generations. For men who had built their entire identity around personal freedom and resistance to centralized authority, Harald's rise was intolerable. But they were not strong enough to defeat him, so they left. They loaded their families, their livestock, their tools, and their household goods onto open ships and sailed into the North Atlantic, aiming for an island that most of them had never seen, across waters that could kill every person on board in a matter of minutes if the weather turned. These were not refugees fleeing in desperation. These were proud, powerful men making a calculated choice. They would rather risk everything on the open ocean than bend the knee to a king they did not choose. And when they arrived in Iceland, they built a society that reflected exactly that principle. No king, no standing army, no centralized power of any kind. Instead, they created the Althing, a general assembly of free men that met once a year at a dramatic rift valley called Thingvellir, where disputes were settled, laws were recited from memory, and the rules of the community were debated and decided by consensus. It was established around 930 AD, and it is arguably the oldest parliamentary institution in the world. More than a century before the Magna Carta, more than 2 centuries before the English Parliament, a group of Norse settlers on a volcanic rock in the middle of the North Atlantic invented representative government because they simply refused to be ruled by anyone they had not chosen themselves. And the society they built was extraordinary in ways that go far beyond politics. Iceland produced the sagas, a body of literature so sophisticated, so psychologically complex, and so beautifully crafted that scholars still study them as some of the finest narrative writing of the medieval world. These were not myths or fairy tales. They were detailed accounts of real families, real feuds, real legal disputes, and real voyages, written in plain Old Norse at a time when virtually every other literary tradition in Europe was producing work in Latin for an audience of priests and monks. The Icelanders wrote for themselves, in their own language, preserving their own history with a precision and a narrative skill that rivaled anything being produced in the monasteries of England or Francia. They maintained genealogies that could trace family lines back for generations. They memorized legal codes of enormous complexity. They created, on an island with no cities, no universities, and no royal patronage, one of the great literary cultures of the medieval world. And they did it because their identity depended on memory. Without a king to define them, without a state to organize them, the Icelanders had only their stories and their laws to hold their society together. And they held it together for over 300 years. But Iceland was not the end of the road. It was a stepping stone. And the next step was taken by a man who was, even by the rough standards of Norse society, spectacularly difficult to live with. His name was Erik Thorvaldsson, known to history as Erik the Red on account of his hair and possibly his temperament. Erik had been exiled from Norway for killing a man. He settled in Iceland and promptly killed more men, earning himself a second exile, this time for 3 years. With nowhere left to go in the known world, Erik sailed west, following rumors of land that had been glimpsed by earlier sailors driven off course by storms. What he found was a massive island, the largest in the world, covered almost entirely by an ice sheet thousands of feet thick. The habitable land was limited to a narrow strip of fjords and coastal valleys on the southwestern edge, green and usable only in the brief Arctic summer. Erik spent his 3 years of exile exploring this coast, and when his banishment ended, he returned to Iceland with a plan. He called the island Greenland. It was, by any honest assessment, one of the most successful acts of false advertising in the history of human settlement. Erik knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that a land called Greenland would attract settlers far more readily than a land called what it actually was, which was mostly a frozen wasteland. And it worked. Around 985 AD, Erik led a fleet of 25 ships carrying settlers, livestock, and supplies from Iceland toward Greenland. Only 14 ships made it. The rest were lost to storms or turned back. But those who survived established 2 colonies on the southwestern coast, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, which would eventually support a combined population of around 5,000 people. Life in Norse Greenland was survival at its most stubborn. The settlers built turf-walled farms in the narrow valleys. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats on pasture land that was usable for only a few months of the year. They built churches, and eventually even had their own bishop, appointed by the Pope in Rome, which tells you something about how seriously they took their connection to Christian Europe, even at the edge of the habitable world. But they could not produce their own iron. They could not grow grain. They had almost no timber. Everything essential that the land could not provide had to be imported from Europe, paid for with the only valuable exports Greenland could offer: walrus, ivory, sealskins, polar bear hides, and live falcons, luxury goods that fetched high prices in European markets but required enormous effort to obtain. Every aspect of existence in Greenland was a negotiation with an environment that did not want human beings there. And every year that the colonies survived was a small victory against odds that never got any better. And then, from their farms on the western coast of Greenland, the settlers began to notice something. Driftwood washed ashore on the beaches, wood from tree species that did not grow anywhere in Greenland or Iceland. Birds arrived in seasonal migrations, flying in from somewhere to the west and returning there in the autumn. The ocean currents carried debris that had no explanation if the world ended at Greenland's western shore. The sagas record that around 986 AD, a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing from Iceland to Greenland, was blown far off course by storms and sighted a coastline to the west that was flat, wooded, and completely unknown. Bjarni did not land. He turned his ship around and eventually made it to Greenland, where he told anyone who would listen about the wooded coast he had seen beyond the Western Sea. Most people shrugged, but one man paid very close attention. He was the son of Eric the Red. He had grown up listening to stories of discovery and exploration, and he was already beginning to plan a voyage that would take him beyond the edge of every map in existence, to a shore that no European had ever touched. His name was Leif Erikson, and what he found across that cold Atlantic water would remain one of history's greatest untold secrets for nearly 1,000 years. Around the year 1000 AD, give or take a few years in either direction, a man named Leif Erikson gathered a crew of 35 sailors, loaded a single ship with provisions, and sailed west from the coast of Greenland into waters that no European had ever crossed. He was not doing this on a whim. He had purchased the ship from Bjarni Herjolfsson, the trader who had sighted an unknown wooded coastline years earlier but had not bothered to land. Leif was more curious than Bjarni, or perhaps more desperate. Greenland needed timber. Greenland needed grazing land. Greenland needed resources that its own frozen landscape could not provide, and if there was even a chance that usable land existed to the west, the risk of sailing into the unknown was worth taking. This was not an expedition of discovery in the grand romantic sense. There were no royal banners, no priests blessing the voyage, no scribes recording the journey for posterity. It was a practical venture by a practical man looking for wood and grass, and what he found, without fully understanding what it meant, was a continent. The sagas describe 3 landings. The first was a place Leif called Helluland, meaning flat stone land, a barren, rocky coastline that most scholars now identify as Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. There was nothing useful there, so they moved on. The second landing was at a place he called Markland, meaning forest land, almost certainly the coast of Labrador, where dense stands of timber came right down to the waterline. This was exactly the kind of resource Greenland needed. But Leif kept going. The third and final landing was at a place the sagas call Vinland, a sheltered bay with mild weather, abundant salmon, and what the Norse described as wild grapes or berries growing on the shore. They built houses. They explored the surrounding land. They spent a winter there, and according to the sagas, the days were longer and the climate gentler than anything they had experienced in Greenland or Iceland. Most scholars now believe that Vinland was located somewhere on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland, in what is now eastern Canada. Leif Erikson and his crew of 35 had just become the first Europeans to set foot in the Western Hemisphere. They were standing on the edge of a continent that contained civilizations, resources, and possibilities that would eventually reshape every aspect of human life on Earth. And they had no idea. To them, it was a good spot for a winter camp with decent fishing and plenty of trees to cut down. They went back to Greenland. Other expeditions followed over the next several years. Leif's brother Thorvald led one. A larger colonization attempt was organized by a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who brought livestock, women, and supplies with the clear intention of building a permanent settlement. But permanence was not possible. The sagas record increasingly hostile encounters with the indigenous peoples of the region, whom the Norse called Skraelings. The details vary between different saga accounts, but the pattern is consistent. Initial contact involved cautious trading, furs and goods exchanged between two peoples who had never seen each other before. Then something went wrong. Violence erupted, and the Norse, numbering at most a few hundred people, thousands of miles from any reinforcement, facing a local population that vastly outnumbered them and knew the land in ways the newcomers never could, made the only rational decision available. They left. Vinland was abandoned within roughly a decade of its first settlement, and the Norse retreated to Greenland, carrying with them stories of a rich and dangerous land across the Western Sea that would be told and retold in the sagas for centuries. For a long time, that was all anyone had. Stories. The Vinland sagas were preserved in Icelandic manuscripts, written down in the 13th century from oral traditions that stretched back 200 years or more, and for most of the modern era, mainstream European scholarship dismissed them as fantasy. The idea that Norse sailors had reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus was treated as a romantic nationalist myth, a Scandinavian fairy tale with no archaeological support. That changed in 1960, when a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad discovered a site at the northern tip of Newfoundland called Lanceau Meadows. What they found there silenced every skeptic in the field. The remains of 8 Norse-style buildings, including a forge where iron had been smelted using techniques that were unmistakably Scandinavian. A bronze cloak pin of a type common in Norse settlements. Butternuts, which do not grow in Newfoundland but do grow further south, suggesting that the Norse had explored well beyond the immediate area of the settlement. Radiocarbon dating placed the site at approximately 1000 AD, matching the saga accounts almost exactly. The debate was over. Europeans had been in North America half a millennium before Columbus sailed from Spain. It was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, and it raised a question that was almost as important as the discovery itself. Why did nobody know? The answer is painfully simple. The Norse did not document their discovery in any language that the centers of European power cared about. They wrote it down in sagas, in Old Norse. Preserved in the literary tradition of Iceland, a tiny, impoverished island on the fringe of Christian Europe that had no political influence and no seat at the table where history was being officially recorded. When Scandinavian culture was absorbed into the broader Christian European world over the 11th and 12th centuries, the sagas were gradually dismissed by continental scholars as pagan folklore, unreliable at best, and pure invention at worst. Meanwhile, when Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he did so with the backing of the Spanish crown, the documentation of a bureaucratic state, the blessing of the Catholic Church, and the full apparatus of European colonial power behind him. His voyage was recorded in Latin, publicized across the courts of Europe, and followed up with wave after wave of colonization, conquest, and exploitation that permanently connected the two hemispheres. Columbus got the credit not because he was first, but because he had institutions behind him. The Norse had none. They had no state, no church hierarchy invested in their achievements, no written bureaucracy to preserve their records in the languages of power. They came, they saw, they built a few houses, and then they went home, and the world moved on without them. There is something devastating about that. 500 years before the course of human history was changed forever by the collision of the old world and the new, a small group of people from the outer edge of European civilization stood on the shore of that same new world. They breathed the same air. They saw the same forests. They met the people who lived there. And then they sailed away, and it meant nothing. No empires were built. No civilizations were destroyed. No diseases were unleashed. No continents were claimed. It was a meeting between worlds that simply did not take, a door that was opened and then quietly closed, and the fact that it happened at all was forgotten for so long that when the door was finally kicked open for good in 1492, the men who did it believed they were the first. They were not. But being first, it turns out, matters far less than being remembered. And at their peak, the Norse were simultaneously present in Baghdad, Constantinople, London, Paris, Normandy, Iceland, Greenland, and the coast of North America. No pre-modern civilization had ever achieved a geographic reach even remotely comparable. And yet, within barely a century, all of it would begin to unravel. To understand how that happened, how the most far-reaching civilization of the medieval world simply ceased to exist, we need to look at the forces that were already gathering to destroy everything the Norse had built. And the most destructive of those forces did not come from their enemies. It came from their own kings, their own leaders, who looked at the old ways and made a calculated decision to burn them down from the inside. To understand what Christianity did to the Norse, you first need to understand what it replaced. Norse religion was not a religion in the way that most people today use that word. There was no church, there was no Bible, there was no clergy, no organized priesthood, no central authority that told people what to believe or how to worship. The Norse spiritual world was local, practical, and deeply personal. A farmer who needed rain sacrificed to Thor, the god of thunder and storms, because Thor controlled the weather and could be persuaded to help if the offering was good enough. A warrior heading into battle called on Odin, the god of war and wisdom, not for moral guidance but for tactical advantage, for cunning and ferocity and the kind of ruthless luck that kept a man alive when the swords came out. A woman hoping for a safe childbirth might appeal to Freya. A trader setting out on a long voyage might make an offering to Njord, the god of the sea. The relationship between humans and gods was transactional. You gave something and you hoped to get something back. There was no concept of sin. There was no promise of salvation. There was no eternal damnation waiting for those who failed to believe the right things. The gods themselves were not moral examples. Odin was a liar and a manipulator. Loki was a trickster who would eventually betray them all. Thor was brave but not particularly wise. The Norse gods were powerful, flawed, and ultimately doomed. Even they could not escape their fate at Ragnarok, the final battle that would destroy the world and the gods along with it. This was not a comforting religion. It was an honest one, and its decentralized, non-hierarchical structure fit perfectly with a society of free men who bowed to no permanent authority, spiritual or political. That was the system that worked. That was the system that had supported Norse expansion across 4 continents, that had fueled the raids and the trade routes and the settlements, that had produced the Althing and the sagas and the Varangian Guard. And that was the system that Scandinavian kings deliberately destroyed, not because it failed, but because it stood in the way of what they wanted. What they wanted was permanent power, and Christianity was the tool that could give it to them. The political logic was devastatingly simple. In the Christian kingdoms of Europe, a king did not rule because his warriors chose to follow him. He ruled because God had chosen him. His authority was divine, permanent, and hereditary. It could not be withdrawn by dissatisfied followers. It could not be challenged by a rival chief who happened to win more battles that year. A Christian king was God's representative on earth, and to rebel against him was to rebel against God himself. For a Norse chief sitting in a smoky hall, dependent on the loyalty of free men who could leave him at any time, watching his power rise and fall with every successful or failed raid, the appeal of this system must have been almost overwhelming. Convert to Christianity, and you were no longer a temporary war leader. You were a king ordained by the almighty creator of the universe. Convert to Christianity, and you gained access to the most powerful institutional network in the medieval world, the Church, with its literate administrators, its diplomatic connections, its ability to legitimize marriages and alliances with every other Christian kingdom in Europe. Convert to Christianity, and you could rewrite the rules of Scandinavian society in your own favor forever. The men who carried out this transformation did so with a brutality that is difficult to reconcile with the religion they claimed to represent. Olaf Tryggvason became King of Norway around 995 AD, and he made the Christianization of his kingdom his central project. Olaf had been baptized in England, where he had spent years as a Viking raider before undergoing a conversion that was almost certainly as political as it was spiritual. He returned to Norway with a new faith, a new set of powerful European allies, and a willingness to impose his beliefs through whatever means necessary. Those who converted voluntarily were rewarded. Those who resisted were given a choice that was no choice at all. The sagas record that Olaf had resistors tortured. He had men blinded. He had others killed outright. He burned pagan temples and cut down the sacred groves where Norse communities had worshipped for generations. In one notorious account, he forced the chieftains of a region to convert by taking their sons hostage, making it clear that the children would suffer if the fathers did not accept baptism. This was not evangelism. This was coercion backed by state violence, carried out by a man who understood that the old religion was not just a set of beliefs, but the foundation of a social order that prevented any single man from holding permanent power. To become a true king, Olaf did not just need to introduce a new god. He needed to destroy the old ones, and everything they represented. Olaf Tryggvason died in battle in the year 1000, but the process he began continued under his successors, most notably Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, who completed the Christianization of Norway with methods that were, if anything, even more violent than his predecessors. Similar campaigns unfolded in Denmark and Sweden over the following decades. In every case, the pattern was the same. A king or aspiring king adopted Christianity, used it to claim divine authority, allied himself with the institutional power of the Church, and then systematically dismantled the old structures that had distributed power among free men. The things, the assemblies where law had been debated and decided by the community, were gradually stripped of their authority and replaced by royal courts where the king's word was law. The old inheritance customs that had kept power fluid and contestable were replaced by the European feudal model, where land and title passed from father to eldest son, in a rigid hierarchy that left no room for the mobility and flexibility that had defined Norse society for centuries. The free warrior who could choose his own leader, who could walk away from a chief who failed him, who owed nothing to any man except what he chose to give, was slowly transformed into something far more familiar to the rest of medieval Europe. A subject, a tenant, a man bound to a lord's land, obligated to serve, forbidden to leave. The very thing that had made the Norse unique, the radical decentralization of power, the personal freedom, the refusal to accept permanent hierarchy, was systematically taken apart and replaced by the same feudal structure that governed every other kingdom in Christendom. And here is the part that makes this story not just sad but genuinely devastating. This was not done by enemies. The English did not impose Christianity on the Norse. The Franks did not conquer Scandinavia and force the population to convert. The Byzantines did not march north with armies and missionaries. This was done by Norse leaders to their own people, for their own benefit. Scandinavian kings looked at the culture that had produced the greatest geographic expansion of the medieval world, the culture of free men and open seas and portable power, and they decided it was less valuable than a crown that could not be taken away. They traded a civilization for a title. They exchanged the loyalty of free warriors for the obedience of feudal subjects. And in doing so, they did not just change Scandinavian politics. They killed the engine that had driven Norse expansion in the first place. Without the desperate, ambitious, mobile younger sons who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, without the fluid power structures that rewarded boldness and punished stagnation, the Norse had no mechanism to sustain what they had built. The raids slowed, the trade routes calcified, the settlements abroad, cut off from the restless energy that had created them, began to drift into the orbit of the local cultures that surrounded them. Christianity did not just convert the Norse, it tamed them, and once they were tamed, the process of disappearing had already begun. That process was not limited to Scandinavia itself. Across every frontier where the Norse had planted themselves, a similar transformation was already underway. In some places, it had been completed so quickly and so thoroughly that by the time the homeland converted, the settlers abroad had already forgotten who they were. And nowhere was this transformation more dramatic, more complete, or more historically consequential than in a strip of northern France that the world would come to know as Normandy. In the year 911 AD, a Frankish king sat across from a Norse warlord and made a deal that would change the course of European history in ways that neither man could have imagined. The king was Charles III of France, known to history by the unfortunate but entirely accurate name Charles the Simple. His kingdom had been devastated by decades of Norse raids. Paris itself had been besieged in 885, its residents trapped behind hastily repaired Roman walls, while a massive Norse fleet occupied the Seine and warriors roamed the countryside at will. The Frankish military had proven unable to stop the raids, unable to defend the coastline, unable to protect the rich monasteries and trading towns that lined the rivers of northern France. Charles was desperate, and desperate kings make deals they would never otherwise consider. The Norse warlord sitting opposite him was named Rollo. His origins are debated. Some sources call him Norwegian, others Danish. But what is not debated is his effectiveness. Rollo had led raids deep into Frankish territory for years, and he had enough warriors under his command to pose a permanent threat to the stability of the entire kingdom. Charles looked at this man, this pagan raider, who had spent his career burning French towns and carrying off French wealth, and he offered him a bargain. Take this land, this enormous stretch of northern France along the English Channel coast. Take it. Settle on it. Call it yours. In exchange, accept baptism into the Christian faith, swear loyalty to the Frankish crown, and defend the coast against any other Norse raiders who come after you. Turn the wolf into the guard dog. Rollo accepted. The territory he was given would become known as Normandy, from the old French Normans, meaning Northmen, the land of the Northmen. And for a generation, that name still meant something. Rollo himself probably never fully abandoned his Norse identity. He spoke Old Norse. He maintained connections with Scandinavia. He ruled his new territory with the same blend of personal authority and warrior loyalty that any Norse chief would have recognized. But the transformation began almost immediately, and its speed was staggering. Rollo's son, William Longsword, grew up bilingual, speaking both Norse and French, navigating both cultures with the flexibility that children of two worlds often develop. But he chose French. He married into Frankish nobility. He adopted Frankish customs and Frankish law. He built churches instead of longships. And when his own son was born, the boy was raised entirely in the French-speaking, Christian, feudal world of the Frankish aristocracy. Within 3 generations, barely 75 years, the descendants of Norse raiders could no longer speak a word of Old Norse. They had adopted French names, French dress, French architecture, French legal systems, and French religious practices. They built some of the most magnificent Romanesque churches and monasteries in Europe. They intermarried so thoroughly with Frankish noble families that their bloodlines were indistinguishable from any other French aristocratic house. They did not just assimilate, they excelled. They became, by almost every measure, more French than the French themselves, overachieving converts to a civilization their grandfathers had tried to burn to the ground. And then, in 1066, the most consequential year in the history of England, the full meaning of what had happened in Normandy exploded onto the world stage. William, Duke of Normandy, great-great-great-grandson of Rollo the Viking, claimed the English throne and assembled an invasion force to take it by force. He crossed the English Channel with an army of Norman knights, French allies, and mercenaries, and on October 14, 1066, he met the English king Harold Godwinson on a hillside near the town of Hastings. The battle lasted most of the day. By evening, Harold was dead, his army shattered, and William, who would be known forever after as William the Conqueror, had seized control of England. It was the last successful invasion of England in history. It reshaped the English language, the English legal system, the English class structure, and the entire trajectory of English civilization for the next 1,000 years. And it was carried out by a man whose ancestor had been a Norse pirate raiding French river towns barely 150 years earlier. But here is the detail that turns this story from remarkable into something almost unbearable. Just 19 days before William landed on the southern coast of England, another army had invaded from the opposite direction. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, the former Varangian guardsman who had fought across the Mediterranean and amassed a fortune in the service of Byzantine emperors, had sailed across the North Sea with a massive fleet and landed in northern England, claiming the English throne for himself. Harold Godwinson had marched his army north at extraordinary speed and met the Norse invasion force at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire on September 25th. The battle was ferocious. Harald Hardrada was killed, reportedly struck in the throat by an arrow, and his army was destroyed so completely that of the 300 ships that had carried the Norse invasion force to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. 19 days later, Harold Godwinson, exhausted and depleted from his victory in the north, turned his army around and marched south to meet William at Hastings. He lost, and in that single month, September and October of 1066, 2 Norse legacies collided at the hinge point of English history. One was still recognizably Norse. Harald Hardrada was a warrior king in the old style, a man who had earned his power through personal combat, foreign service, and the loyalty of free warriors who followed him by choice. The other was something entirely new. William of Normandy was a feudal lord, a Christian duke, a French-speaking product of the very civilization the Norse had once tried to destroy. One remembered what it was, the other had completely forgotten. And at Hastings, the one that had forgotten won, the one that still remembered died in a field in Yorkshire, and with it died the last serious Norse military threat to Western Europe. That is what makes Normandy so important to this story. It was not just a case of assimilation. It was a preview, a proof of concept for how the entire Norse world would end. The Norse did not lose to the civilizations they raided and settled among. They became those civilizations. They married into them. They adopted their languages, their gods, their laws, their customs, and every time they did, another fragment of the original Norse identity vanished. In Normandy, it took 3 generations. In the Danelaw of England, it took a little longer. In Russia, where the Varangian rulers of the Kievan Rus adopted Slavic language and Byzantine Christianity, it took barely 2. The mechanism was always the same. The Norse arrived as conquerors and became converts. They won the land and lost themselves. And across every frontier where this process played out, the reach of Norse civilization shrank a little more until only the most remote settlements remained, the ones too far from any other culture to be absorbed. But even those would not last. The most haunting disappearance of all did not happen in the courts of France or the fields of England. It happened at the very edge of the habitable world, in a place where there was no neighboring culture to absorb them, no foreign language to adopt, no church to convert them. There was only ice, silence, and a slowly shifting climate that would erase them as completely as if they had never existed at all. Of all the places the Norse planted themselves, Greenland was the most improbable and the most stubborn. For nearly 500 years, 2 small communities of European settlers clung to the southwestern coast of the largest island on Earth, raising cattle in valleys that froze solid for 8 months of the year, building stone churches within sight of glaciers that stretched to the horizon, baptizing their children and burying their dead in ground that had to be thawed with bonfires before a grave could be dug. The eastern settlement and the western settlement, separated by several hundred miles of coastline, supported a combined population that reached roughly 5,000 people at its peak. They had farms with stone-walled enclosures for livestock. They had a cathedral at Baghdad, the seat of a bishop appointed by the Pope in Rome, complete with stained glass windows and a bell that rang across the fjord on Sunday mornings. They had trade ships that made the dangerous crossing to Norway and Iceland, carrying walrus ivory, sealskins, polar bear hides, and live white falcons, luxury goods that fetched high prices in European courts and kept the slender economic lifeline to the outside world intact. These were not adventurers camping on the ice. These were permanent communities, generation after generation of families who were born, lived, worked, married, raised children, grew old, and died on that frozen coast, as committed to their way of life as any farming village in England or France, and then they vanished. Not in a single catastrophic event, not in a battle or a plague or a natural disaster that left a clear mark in the historical record. They vanished slowly, silently, and so completely that when Europeans finally returned to Greenland centuries later, they found nothing but ruins and silence, and the howling Arctic wind blowing through the empty doorways of stone churches that no one had entered in longer than anyone could remember. The killings started with the climate. Beginning in the 13th century, the North Atlantic entered a period of sustained cooling known as the Little Ice Age. The effects were gradual at first, but relentless. Growing seasons shortened. Summers that had once been warm enough to sustain European-style hay farming became cooler and wetter, producing less and less fodder for the cattle and sheep that were the foundation of Norse Greenland's food supply. Sea ice expanded southward, pushing further into the shipping lanes that connected Greenland to Iceland and Norway. Voyages that had once been difficult but manageable became increasingly dangerous, and the ships came less and less often. At the same time, the economic foundation that justified those dangerous voyages was collapsing. For centuries, walrus ivory had been Greenland's most valuable export, prized across Europe for carvings, chess pieces, and luxury goods. But during the Crusades, European merchants had opened new trade routes to Africa and the Middle East, and through those routes came elephant ivory, cheaper, more abundant, and easier to work than walrus tusk. The market for Greenland's primary export evaporated over the course of a few decades. Without ivory to sell, Greenland had almost nothing that European merchants considered worth the risk of the crossing. The ships slowed to a trickle. Then they stopped coming at all. The western settlement was the first to die. It was the smaller and more northerly of the 2 colonies, more exposed to the worsening climate and further from the shipping routes. Archaeological evidence suggests it was abandoned sometime around the middle of the 14th century, though the exact date is impossible to pin down because there are no written records of its final years. What we know comes from a single haunting account. Sometime after the western settlement had gone silent, a party from the eastern settlement sailed north along the coast to find out what had happened to their neighbors. What they found when they arrived has stayed in the historical record like a scar. The farms were empty. The buildings were intact but abandoned. Livestock wandered freely, unfed and untended, suggesting that the departure had not been planned or organized. There were no bodies, there were no signs of violence or struggle. The people who had lived there, families who had maintained those farms for generations, had simply gone. Where they went is a question that has never been answered with certainty. Some may have tried to reach the eastern settlement. Some may have attempted the crossing to Iceland. Some may have walked inland and died in the ice. The western settlement did not end with a last stand or a dramatic evacuation. It ended with absence. One day there were people there, and then there were not. And the empty buildings stood in the cold like headstones for a community that nobody came to mourn. The Inuit were watching all of this. As the climate shifted and the ice pushed southward, the Thule Inuit, ancestors of the modern Greenlandic Inuit, expanded down the coast from the north, moving into territories that the worsening conditions had made uninhabitable for the Norse, but that were perfectly suited to Inuit survival techniques developed over thousands of years of Arctic living. The Inuit hunted seals from kayaks. They fished through holes in the ice. They built shelters from snow and animal skins that could be erected in hours and abandoned without loss. They wore clothing engineered for extreme cold and traveled with a mobility and efficiency that the Norse, tied to their fixed farms and European livestock, could not match. The contrast was stark and, in retrospect, fatal. The Norse settlers in Greenland had maintained a European pastoral lifestyle for centuries, and they refused to abandon it even as the environment made it increasingly impossible. They kept raising cattle even when there was not enough hay to feed them through the winter. They kept building with stone even when Inuit snow shelters were warmer and more practical. Whether this was cultural pride, religious conviction, or simple stubbornness is impossible to know, but the result was the same. The Inuit adapted and thrived. The Norse held on to what they knew and starved. Whether there was direct conflict between the two groups is still debated among historians and archaeologists. Some Inuit oral traditions describe encounters with the Norse, not all of them peaceful. Some archaeological sites show evidence of contact and possibly trade. But what is beyond debate is the outcome. The Inuit survived. The Norse did not. The last written record of the Norse in Greenland is a document describing a wedding. In 1408, a marriage was performed at the Livelsi church in the eastern settlement, and the event was recorded in enough detail that it survived in Icelandic archives. The church where the wedding took place still stands, or at least its stone walls do, the best preserved Norse ruin in Greenland, a small rectangular building overlooking a fjord that is as beautiful and as empty now as it must have been on the day the last worshipper walked out the door and never came back. After 1408 there is nothing, no letters, no trade records, no ship logs, no church correspondence. The Bishop of Gardar had already stopped residing in Greenland years earlier, administering his diocese from a comfortable distance in Scandinavia. The Pope continued to appoint bishops to the See of Gardar for decades after the colony had effectively ceased to exist, unaware or indifferent to the fact that there was no longer anyone there to receive them. When European ships finally returned to the coast of Greenland in the early 18th century, sent by the Danish-Norwegian crown to re-establish contact with what they still technically considered a colonial possession, they found ruins. Stone church walls standing open to the sky. Farm enclosures filled with wind-blown soil and creeping ice. No people. No graves that told the story of a final generation. No written message scratched into stone by the last survivor. Just emptiness. And the slow, patient work of the Arctic, reclaiming the land that had been borrowed from it for 500 years. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with. The Norse of Greenland were not conquered. They were not massacred. They were not struck down by a plague that swept through in a single terrible season. They were forgotten. The civilization they belonged to, the trade networks they depended on, the church they prayed in, the kingdoms they pledged loyalty to, all of it simply moved on without them. Ships stopped sailing. Letters stopped arriving, and at some point, in some year that nobody recorded, the people of Norse Greenland must have understood that the world they had been connected to for centuries no longer knew they existed, and was not coming to help them. That realization, the slow dawning knowledge that you have been abandoned by the civilization that defined your identity, that you are utterly and permanently alone at the edge of the world, may be the most devastating moment in this entire story. And it was only the final chapter of a much larger disappearance. because by the time the last Norse Greenlanders vanished into the ice, the civilization they had belonged to had already been taken apart from within, dismantled not by enemies but by the very forces that its own astonishing success had set in motion. If you could somehow watch the map of Norse civilization from above, compressing centuries into minutes, what you would see between roughly 1050 and 1150 AD is not a collapse. It is not the familiar pattern of borders shrinking under military pressure, of armies retreating, of cities falling to invaders. What you would see is something far stranger. You would see the color drain out of the map. Every settlement, every trade route, every outpost and kingdom that the Norse had built over 3 centuries would simply fade, not into enemy territory, but into the territory around it, blending so seamlessly into the local culture that within a generation or two, there would be no visible difference between the places the Norse had been and the places they had not. It would look less like a defeat and more like a disappearing act, as if an entire civilization had decided, frontier by frontier, generation by generation, to stop being itself. And the most unsettling thing about watching it happen is that nobody fought it, nobody resisted. The Norse did not go down swinging, they went down assimilating. And by the time the process was complete, the most geographically expansive civilization of the medieval world had been so thoroughly absorbed into the peoples around it that its own descendants no longer knew it had existed. Start in England. The Danelaw, that vast stretch of eastern and northern England where Norse law and Norse custom had prevailed for over a century, was gradually absorbed into the unified English kingdom during the 10th and 11th centuries. The process was not violent. It was administrative. English kings extended their authority over former Norse territories through a combination of military pressure and political integration, and the Norse settlers, who had already been intermarrying with Anglo-Saxon communities for generations, simply merged into the English population. They kept farming the same land. They kept living in the same towns. But they stopped speaking Norse. They stopped following Norse law. Their children were baptized in English churches and given English names. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, the Danelaw was English in every meaningful sense. The Norse settlers had not been driven out. They had become the people next door, moved to Normandy, and the same process had already been completed even faster. Rollo's descendants had abandoned Old Norse within 3 generations and become fully French, moved to Russia, and the transformation was faster still. The Varangian rulers of the Kievan Rus, the Norse dynasty that had established the first organized state in Eastern Europe, adopted the Slavic language of their subjects, converted to Orthodox Christianity through their connection with Constantinople, and embraced Byzantine political culture so thoroughly that by the mid-11th century there was nothing recognizably Norse about them except their dynastic name. Moved to Ireland, where the Norse had established trading towns at Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick, and the same pattern holds. The Norse settlements became Irish towns. The settlers intermarried with Irish families, adopted Irish customs, and within a few generations, the only evidence that they had ever been Norse at all was the occasional Scandinavian name in a family tree and the layout of streets that had been planned by Norse merchants centuries earlier. Moved to Sicily, where Norman adventurers, the same Norse-descended Normans who had conquered England, had carved out a kingdom in the Mediterranean, and watched them become Italian, absorbing Arab, Greek, and Latin influences into a hybrid culture that retained nothing of its Scandinavian origins except a vague ancestral memory. Everywhere, in every direction, on every frontier, the same thing happened. The Norse arrived, they settled, they intermarried, and they vanished into the local population like water soaking into dry ground. The question that demands an answer is how? How does a civilization that stretched from North America to Baghdad simply disappear? And the answer is as simple as it is devastating. The Norse had no institutional infrastructure to preserve their identity across generations in foreign lands. They had no written administrative language. Old Norse was a spoken language for most of the Viking Age, and when it was eventually written down, it was written in runes that were used primarily for short inscriptions, not for the kind of record-keeping that sustains a bureaucracy or an educational system. They had no state church that could maintain cultural continuity through religious practice. They had no schools, no universities, no system for transmitting a standardized version of Norse identity to the next generation. Everything that held Norse culture together was personal, oral, and local. The sagas were told around fires, not printed in books. The laws were memorized, not codified in archives. The genealogies were carried in the heads of living people, not recorded in institutional registers. And the moment a Norse community settled among a larger, more institutionally developed culture, all of those personal oral traditions began to erode. The children learned the local language because it was more useful. The grandchildren forgot the old one because nobody was teaching it to them anymore. The great-grandchildren had no idea their ancestors had ever spoken anything else. The loss of language was the killing blow, and it happened everywhere with the same terrible speed. Language is not just a way of communicating. It is the vessel that carries a culture's memory, its stories, its sense of who it is and where it came from. When the Norse in Normandy stopped speaking Old Norse and started speaking French, they did not just change the sounds coming out of their mouths. They lost access to the entire body of oral tradition that connected them to Scandinavia. The sagas, the myths, the genealogies, the legal formulas, the poetry, all of it existed in Old Norse and could not survive translation into a language that had no framework for it. The same thing happened in the Danelaw when Old Norse merged with Old English. The same thing happened in Russia when the Varangian elite adopted Slavic. Each time the language died, the memory died with it, and a community that had been Norse became something else, something that had no recollection of longships or rune stones or the gods of Asgard. And hovering over all of this, accelerating and completing the process, was the Church. Christianity did not just replace Norse gods with a Christian god, it replaced Norse memory with Christian memory. The monks and priests who now controlled literacy across Scandinavia and every Norse settlement in Europe had no interest in preserving the oral traditions of the people who had spent 2 centuries burning their monasteries and killing their brothers. The sagas were pagan stories. The genealogies traced descent from pagan heroes and pagan gods. The legal traditions were rooted in a pagan social order. All of it was, from the Church's perspective, at best irrelevant and at worst dangerous, and it was systematically displaced by Latin texts, Christian histories, and a European worldview that defined civilization as beginning with baptism and everything before it as darkness. The Norse past was not just forgotten, it was actively written over, buried beneath layers of Christian narrative that had no room for the men who had once sailed to the edge of the world and beyond. There is no other civilization in recorded history that did what the Norse did. There are empires that expanded and then contracted. There are peoples who were conquered and absorbed by stronger powers. There are cultures that declined gradually over centuries until they were shadows of what they had been. But the Norse are unique. They expanded across a wider geographic range than any pre-modern civilization, and then they disappeared not because they were defeated, but because they were too successful at adapting to the worlds they entered. They were so fluid, so flexible, so willing to integrate and intermarry and adopt new ways of living, that they integrated themselves out of existence. The very thing that had made them the most versatile people of the medieval world became the instrument of their erasure. And when it was done, when the last Old Norse speaker in Normandy had died, and the last Varangian name in Russia had been replaced by a Slavic one, and the last pagan memory in Scandinavia had been overwritten by a Christian sermon, there was almost nothing left. Almost. Because buried beneath the layers of assimilation, hidden in the genetic code of millions of people who had no idea of their ancestry, encoded in the vocabulary of languages that had absorbed Norse words so deeply they could never be removed, the traces remained, and 1,000 years later, the ground itself would begin to give up its secrets. The Norse vanished from history, but they did not vanish from the earth. The earth remembers what people forget. It holds things in its soil that no amount of cultural erasure, no rewriting of textbooks, no centuries of deliberate forgetting can destroy. Bones do not change their story to suit the politics of the people living above them. Coins buried in a field do not care whether the civilization that minted them has been written out of the official record. And slowly, patiently, over the last 50 years, the ground has been giving up its secrets. What it has revealed is a picture of the Norse world that is bigger, stranger, more complex, and more important than anything the history books ever told us. And with every new discovery, The gap between what actually happened and what we were taught grows wider. It started in 1960, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, in a place called Lanceau Meadows. A Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad had spent years studying the Vinland sagas, and unlike most of the academic establishment, he believed they were describing real places. He and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, went looking for physical proof, and they found it in a cluster of overgrown mounds on a windswept coastal meadow. When they began to dig, they uncovered the remains of 8 Norse-style buildings, including dwellings, a workshop, and a forge where iron had been smelted from bog ore using techniques that were unmistakably Scandinavian. They found a small bronze cloak pin of a type common in Norse settlements across the North Atlantic. They found butternuts, which do not grow anywhere near Newfoundland but do grow further south along the North American coast, suggesting that whoever lived here had explored well beyond the immediate settlement. Radiocarbon dating placed the site at approximately 1000 AD. The sagas were not fiction. Europeans had been in North America 500 years before Columbus. The impact on the historical establishment was seismic. For decades, mainstream scholars had dismissed the Vinland accounts as romantic mythology, Scandinavian fairy tales with no basis in reality. Lanceau Meadows did not just prove them wrong, it forced an uncomfortable reckoning with how much else the academic world might have gotten wrong about the Norse, and how much of what had been dismissed as myth might turn out to be memory. That reckoning deepened dramatically in 2017, when a discovery from a very different kind of dig forced the world to confront another set of assumptions. In the town of Birka, Sweden, one of the most important Viking Age trading centers in Scandinavia, archaeologists had excavated a high-status grave in the late 19th century. The burial contained a full set of weapons, including a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, and 2 horses. A set of gaming pieces suggested someone who studied military strategy. For over a century, the grave had been interpreted without question as the burial of a male warrior, a powerful man of high rank. Then a team of researchers conducted DNA analysis on the skeletal remains. The warrior was a woman. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic world and far beyond it. It ignited a fierce global debate about the role of women in Norse society, about how deeply modern gender assumptions had shaped the interpretation of archaeological evidence, and about how many other graves, how many other artifacts, how many other conclusions about the past might be built on foundations of bias rather than evidence. The Birka warrior did not just challenge a single identification. She challenged the entire framework through which the Norse had been understood for over a century, a framework that had been built not on what the evidence showed but on what the people studying it expected to find. And then there is the genetic evidence, which tells a story so vast and so detailed that it makes the written historical record look like a rough sketch. In the last 2 decades, large-scale DNA studies have traced Norse genetic markers across an astonishing range of modern populations. From Iceland to Turkey, from the Shetland Islands to Ukraine, from Normandy to the coast of Greenland, the biological fingerprint of Norse expansion is still measurable in the DNA of millions of people who have no idea of their ancestry. The Norse did not just raid and trade. They married. They had children. They wove themselves into the genetic fabric of every population they touched, and that fabric has survived 1,000 years of cultural forgetting. The DNA does not care that the history books forgot. It remembers. The silver remembers too. Across Scandinavia, and particularly on the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, archaeologists continue to uncover hoards of Arab silver dirhams in quantities that stagger the imagination. Gotland alone has produced more Islamic silver coins than most archaeological sites in the Middle East itself. Each coin is a physical object that was minted in Baghdad or Samarkand or some other city of the Abbasid Caliphate, carried north along the river routes by Norse traders, and buried in Scandinavian soil 1,000 years ago. Each one is a tiny, undeniable proof of a trade connection between the frozen north and the Islamic world that most people alive today have never heard of. The coins do not need anyone to believe in them. They simply exist, waiting in the ground for someone to dig them up and ask the obvious question, which is how on earth did a silver coin from Baghdad end up in a field in Sweden? And finally, there is the evidence that does not require any digging at all, because it is embedded in the language you are listening to right now. The English language is full of Norse words, so deeply embedded that most English speakers have no idea they are using vocabulary that arrived with Scandinavian settlers over 1,000 years ago. The word law is Norse. The word husband is Norse. Window, egg, sky, knife, anger, happy, wrong, gift, trust, take, call, die. The list is enormous. Hundreds of common English words that trace directly back to Old Norse and entered the language not through books or cultural exchange, but through the daily speech of Norse communities, living side by side with English-speaking neighbours in the Danelaw. And it goes deeper than vocabulary. The English pronouns they, them, and their are Norse. The basic pronoun system of one of the most widely spoken languages on Earth is a Norse inheritance. That does not happen through casual contact. That happens when two populations live together so intimately, for so long, that their languages fuse at the structural level. The Norse are not gone from the English language. They are built into its foundations. Every time an English speaker says the word they, a 1,000-year-old echo of Old Norse passes through their mouth without them knowing it. The evidence is everywhere, once you learn to see it. In the ground, in the blood, in the words we speak every day without thinking, and all of it, taken together, raises a question that goes beyond archaeology and linguistics and genetics. It raises a question about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget, about who gets to decide which civilizations matter and which ones disappear from the story, and about what it means when the truth has been hiding in plain sight for 1,000 years and nobody bothered to look. The Norse did not fail. This is the point that needs to be stated clearly before anything else, because the fact that they disappeared has led generations of historians to assume that something went wrong, that there was some fatal flaw in Norse civilization that caused it to collapse. There was no flaw, there was no collapse. The Norse succeeded. They succeeded so completely, so thoroughly, across so many different frontiers and in so many different ways, that they wove themselves into the fabric of a dozen different cultures and became indistinguishable from the people around them. They did not vanish because they were weak. They vanished because they were everywhere. And the story of why nobody noticed, why the most geographically expansive civilization of the medieval world was reduced in popular memory to a cartoon of horned helmets and burning villages, is not just a failure of historical scholarship. It is a lesson in who gets to control the past, who decides which civilizations are remembered and which ones are erased, and what happens to the truth when the people holding the pen have their own story to protect. For centuries after the Norse dissolved into the cultures of Europe, the historical record was controlled almost entirely by the Church. The men who wrote the chronicles, who maintained the archives, who taught in the schools and universities that shaped European intellectual life, were monks and priests and bishops, the institutional descendants of the very people the Norse had terrorized for 300 years. These men had no interest in telling a complex, nuanced story about Norse civilization. They had no motivation to describe the trade networks, the parliamentary traditions, the navigational genius, the legal innovations, or the sheer geographic ambition of a people who had spent generations burning their monasteries and enslaving their brothers. The story the Church wanted to tell was simple and self-serving. There were pagans, they were barbaric, they raided and killed and worshipped false gods. And then Christianity arrived, and the barbarians were civilized, and the light of Christ triumphed over the darkness of the North. That was the narrative that served the Church's interests, and because the Church controlled literacy, controlled education, and controlled the institutions through which history was recorded and transmitted, that was the narrative that survived. Everything else, every detail that complicated the story or made the Norse look like something more than savage heathens waiting to be saved, was quietly left out. Then, in the 19th century, a different kind of distortion took hold. As nationalism swept across Europe, Scandinavian countries and Germanic-speaking peoples began looking for heroic ancestors to anchor their national identities, and they seized on the Vikings with an enthusiasm that had almost nothing to do with historical reality. The image of the Viking that most people carry in their heads today, the blonde giant in a horned helmet swinging an axe, was largely invented during this period. The horned helmets are pure fiction. No archaeological evidence has ever shown that the Norse wore them. The image was created by costume designers for Scandinavian operas and romantic paintings, and it stuck because it was dramatic and memorable, and because nobody bothered to check. The berserker, the mindless warrior consumed by battle rage, was exaggerated from a minor and poorly understood element of Norse culture into a defining characteristic. The complexity of Norse society, the trade, the law, the exploration, the art, was stripped away and replaced by a one-dimensional image of racial and martial superiority that had far more to do with 19th-century European politics than with anything that happened in the Viking Age. And then that image was seized by an even darker force. Nazi ideology adopted Norse symbols, Norse mythology, and the distorted image of the Viking warrior as props for its racial theories. The swastika, the runes, the concept of a pure Northern European master race, all of it was draped in a bastardized version of Norse heritage that contaminated the field so thoroughly that for decades after the Second World War, serious academic study of Norse civilization was tainted by association. Scholars avoided the subject. Funding dried up. The Norse were trapped between two distortions, one that made them into mindless barbarians and another that made them into racial icons, and the real civilization disappeared beneath both. And then there was Columbus. The discovery that the Norse had reached North America 5 centuries before the voyage of 1492 was not simply a piece of trivia that the historical establishment failed to notice. It was a direct threat to one of the foundational narratives of Western civilization, the Age of Discovery. The story of European nations boldly venturing across the oceans to find and claim new worlds was central to the identity of Spain, Portugal, England, France, and every other colonial power that built its wealth and its self-image on the idea that 1492 was the beginning of a new era in human history. Admitting that a group of Scandinavian farmers had already made the crossing, without royal backing, without a bureaucratic state, without any of the institutional machinery that was supposed to be necessary for such achievements, did not just add a footnote to the story. It undermined the entire framework. If the Norse could reach North America in an open boat with 35 men and no compass, then what exactly was so special about Columbus and the monarchies that funded him? The resistance to the Norse discovery of America was not passive neglect. It was active institutional pushback from a scholarly establishment that had built its entire understanding of world history around a date that turned out to be 500 years too late. Beneath all of these specific distortions lies a deeper, structural problem. History, as it is taught and remembered, has a strong bias towards civilizations that leave certain kinds of evidence. Written archives in the languages of power, monumental architecture, institutional continuity, a church or a state or a dynasty that survives long enough to champion its own memory. The Norse left almost none of these things. They wrote in runes, not in Latin. They built with wood, not stone. Their institutional legacy was absorbed into other cultures so quickly that no continuous Norse organization survived to advocate for their place in history. What they left instead were sagas preserved in Icelandic manuscripts that most European scholars could not read, ship burials that were looted or forgotten, trade goods scattered across a dozen countries, and runes scratched into the railings of other people's buildings. It was the kind of evidence that required effort to find, effort to interpret, and effort to connect into a coherent picture. And for a very long time, nobody made that effort, because the simple story was easier. Vikings were barbarians. Columbus discovered America. The Middle Ages were a time of Christian civilization slowly taming the darkness of the pagan world. These stories were clean, teachable, and useful to the people in power. The truth was messier, more complicated, and far more interesting. But the truth did not have an institution to protect it. The erasure of Norse civilization from mainstream historical understanding is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and more dangerous than a conspiracy. It is the slow, grinding, almost automatic process by which complex realities are flattened into simple narratives, because simple narratives are easier to teach, easier to remember, easier to fit into the frameworks that powerful institutions need to justify their own existence. It does not require anyone to deliberately lie. It only requires people to not ask questions, to accept the version of the past they were handed, and to never wonder what might be missing. And that is exactly what happened. For 1,000 years, while one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history lay buried just beneath the surface of the story we were told. And so we arrive at the final question, the one this entire story has been building toward. The question that connects a burning ship on the Volga in 921 AD to the empty ruins of a Greenland church to the Norse runes carved into the marble of the Hagia Sophia to the word you just used without thinking when you said, they. The Norse built the most geographically expansive network of any pre-modern civilization on Earth. They reached 4 continents. They traded furs and slaves for Arab silver in the markets of the Caspian. They guarded the bedchambers of Byzantine emperors in the golden halls of Constantinople. They founded a parliamentary assembly on a volcanic island in the North Atlantic that still functions today. They set foot on the coast of North America 500 years before Columbus was born. They built kingdoms in England, principalities in Russia, a duchy in France that conquered England all over again, and trading posts from Ireland to the Black Sea. They did all of this without a centralized state, without a standing army, without a written bureaucracy, without any of the institutional machinery that every other great civilization in history relied upon to project and sustain its power. And then they dissolved, not defeated, not conquered, not destroyed by plague or famine or the swords of a stronger enemy. They dissolved. Like salt poured into warm water, they spread so thoroughly into the world around them that they became undetectable, present in everything and visible in nothing, woven into the fabric of a dozen different cultures so completely that their own descendants forgot they had ever been anything else. They are the only civilization in recorded history that disappeared not because it was weak, but because it was everywhere. And the question this raises is not just a question about the past. It is a question about identity itself, about what it means to survive, about whether a people can truly be said to exist if they have traded everything that made them distinct for the comfort and stability of belonging to something larger. The Norse story forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth: adaptability, the quality we are taught to admire above almost all others, the ability to change, to integrate, to become whatever the situation requires, is also the most effective mechanism of self-destruction. The Norse were the most adaptable people of the medieval world. They could become French in 3 generations. They could become Russian in 2. They could adopt Christianity, feudal law, Latin literacy, and European court culture without missing a step. And every time they adapted, every time they became something new, they lost something old. A language, a legal tradition, a set of stories, a way of seeing the world. Assimilation is not survival. It looks like survival from the outside, because the people are still there, still breathing, still living in the same houses and farming the same land. But the thing that made them who they were, the identity that connected them to their ancestors and to each other, is gone. And once it is gone, it does not come back. Think about how many cultures in the world right now are going through exactly the same process. Think about how many languages are dying, not because anyone is banning them, but because the children choose to speak something more useful, and the grandparents take the old words with them when they go. Think about how many traditions are being quietly set aside, not because they were forbidden, but because they no longer seem relevant in a world that rewards sameness and efficiency over distinctiveness and memory. Think about how many peoples, all across the world, are making the same bargain that every Norse community made 1,000 years ago, trading identity for integration, distinctiveness for acceptance, the hard work of being different for the ease of fitting in. Nobody is forcing them. That is the part that makes it so hard to fight. Nobody forced the Norse in Normandy to stop speaking Old Norse. They just stopped. Nobody forced the Varangian rulers of Russia to adopt Slavic customs. They just did. The dissolution was voluntary, and that is what makes it so complete and so irreversible. There is one more lesson buried in this story, and it may be the most important one of all. History is not written by the victors. That old saying is wrong. History is written by whoever builds the institutions that outlast them. The Norse built ships. The Church built universities. The Norse explored the world. The colonial powers documented it. The Norse reached North America in the year 1000. Columbus reached it in 1492 with a royal charter, a fleet funded by a monarchy, and a bureaucratic apparatus that recorded, publicized, and followed up on every detail of the voyage. 500 years of priority meant nothing, because the Norse had no institution to carry their memory forward. Importance without institutional memory is invisible. Achievement without documentation is myth. And myth, as we have seen, is very easy to dismiss. Return. one last time, to the Volga River. The year is 921 AD. A ship is burning on the water. Inside it, a dead Norse chieftain lies dressed in silk and gold, surrounded by the sacrificed bodies of animals and a young woman who followed him into death. The fire climbs into the grey sky. The warriors beat their shields. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan watches from the bank, recording every detail in a text that will survive 1,000 years. The fire burns hot and fast, and then it burns down to nothing, and the ashes scatter on the surface of the river, and the current carries them away, and the water closes over them, and the river keeps flowing as if nothing happened at all. That is the story of the Norse. A fire that burned so brightly it touched every corner of the known world. And then it went out, and the world carried on as if none of it had ever happened. But it did happen. The Norse reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They guarded the emperors of Constantinople. They traded with the caliphs of Baghdad. They built the oldest parliament in Europe. They carved their names into the stone of the Hagia Sophia, and most of us were never taught a single word of it. So the question you need to ask yourself is this: what else has history chosen to forget? What other civilizations, what other achievements, what other truths are lying buried beneath the version of the past we were handed in school? And the most unsettling question of all, the one that connects a burning ship on a Russian river 1,000 years ago to the world you are living in right now. Could it happen again? Could an entire way of life, an entire people's identity, simply dissolve into the world around it, not through war, not through conquest, but through the quiet, voluntary, almost invisible act of choosing, generation by generation, to become something else? What do you think? Could history repeat itself?